Okay, and again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to OneShul. My name is Brian, and thank you for joining me here for a Monday Night Mitzvah, which is our weekly Torah study here. This week, we're going to be looking at the Torah Parsha Emor, which is the book of Leviticus, chapter 21, verse 1 through 24, verse 23. Before I begin, I always like to say a blessing for studying Torah beforehand. If you know it and you want to care to say it with me, please feel free. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kadishanu b'mitzvotav la'asot b'divrei Torah. Okay. Now, before we get into the interpretations, what the meaning behind just the simple words on the page of the Torah tell us, first, let's just look at what the Torah and what our Torah Parsha for this week, just like the Cliff Notes version, just what it, in a nutshell, says the overall story of it. The Torah section of Emor, which means speak, begins with special laws pertaining to the Kohanim, which are the priests, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and the temple service. A Kohen may not become ritually impure through contact with a corpse, a dead body basically, save on the occasion of a death of a close relative. A Kohen may not marry a divorcee or a woman with a promiscuous past, say if she was involved in harlotry, prostitution, unsavory things like that. A Kohen Gadol can only marry a virgin. A Kohen with a physical deformity cannot serve in the holy temple, nor can a deformed animal be brought in as an offering. A newborn calf, lamb, or kid must be left with its mother for 7 days before being eligible to be used as an offering. And one may not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. The second part of Emor lists the annual callings of holiness. These are the festivals of the Jewish calendar. The weekly Shabbat, the bringing of the Passover offering on 14 Nisan, the 7-day Passover festival beginning on 15 Nisan, the bringing of the Emor offering from the first barley harvest on the second day of Passover, and the commencement on that day of the 49-day counting of the Emor, culminating in the festival of Shavuot on the 50th day, which we have Shavuot coming up pretty soon, less than a month from now. A remembrance of shofar blowing on the 1st of Tishrei, a solemn fast day on the 10th of Tishrei, the Sukkot festival, during which we dwell in huts for 7 days and take the 4 kinds, beginning on the 15th of Tishrei, and the immediately following holiday of the 8th day of Sukkot, which is Shemini Astoret. Next, the Torah discusses the lighting of the menorah in the temple and the showbread that is placed weekly on the table there. Emor then concludes with the retelling of an incident of a man who is executed for blasphemy, and then further tells more about the penalties for murder, intentionally causing the death of another person, and for injuring a fellow or destroying his property. This works with the idea of monetary compensation. It starts to work on the Jewish side, the legal side of Jewish law. Now, our Parsha for this week begins with laws regarding maintaining the purity of the members of the priesthood. And it seems to focus a lot, especially when they're dealing with corpses, dead bodies. Now, seeing as the priests were seen as representatives of God, their maintaining their godlike purity was totally essential. It was like one of the highest things that they could do. They needed to remain in a state of cleanliness, purity, and they equated that with holiness. They needed to stay in that state all the time. The priest, in contrast to the average Israelite, must stay clear of avoidable impurity, because there's things that cause us to be impure that the average Jew can come across. And it's just one of these things that, if they come across one of these things and they become, ritually impure, they cleanse themselves, and when the sun sets at the end of the day, they're considered pure again. And it's not a major deal. For the priests, they have to maintain purity all the time. So for them, it's a lot more important, and it really becomes a big deal for them. So we're told that they must stay clear of avoidable impurity and must avoid nearing the sacred when they have become unavoidably impure, in the case where sometimes the priest just cannot avoid it and they become impure. They have to avoid all the sacred vestments, coming near the holy, coming into the holy. They have to avoid all those, since they are considered to be holy in the highest degree. So they make a point to try to, at all costs, avoid becoming impure. But there are times, and the Torah tells us where, especially when it talks about, coming near a corpse, a dead body, they're to avoid that, except in the instance where it's like a close blood relative. Then, they can, be near the corpse and handle it possibly if they have to, but they have to purify themselves, and it's more an intense process because priests at this point, they're held to a higher degree of purity standards. In this case, my place here. Thus, the layman Israelite may come into contact with a corpse as long as they dispose of their impurity afterwards. Priests may not do so unless the deceased is a close blood relative. In that case, the priest must avoid any and all contact with the sacred until they have been cleansed. And as I was saying before, for the priests, their cleansing ritual is a little bit more intense than, say, the average layman Israelite has to do. Now, when we went over the overview of our Parsha for this week, a lot of it seems, pretty straightforward. You can read what it says on the page in the Torah, and get a pretty much idea of what each thing is talking about. So we don't really need to dive into each little specific thing individual, but we can, for interpretation purposes and everything, we can take this moment, we can sort of take a step back and look at, what is our Parsha this week, and it ties into the broader concept of the book of Leviticus. Okay, what is the underlying meaning of the whole greater sum of it all? Okay, now we look at where we're at in our Torah study now. The Torah starts out with the book of Genesis, which reads very much like a history book. It tells us, how creation happened, how God created the universe, how everything got started, how the ball got rolling. Reads like a history book. Then we get to Exodus, which continues to read like a history book, where this time it's discussing, the birth and the creation of basically us, the nation of Israel. Then as time goes on, certain rules begin. We're given the very first hint of the basics of the rules, where we get the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus. Now we get to where we're at now in the book of Leviticus, which is lots and lots and lots of rules, with sprinkled in with these rules, sometimes we have like an example of a certain rule and how it is to be carried out, and what the punishment is for it. Now, let's take a few minutes now to just let's examine the seemingly multitude of rules in our faith and in our tradition. We can be totally honest here. At first glance, it does seem like in our tradition that there are a lot of rules. Okay, so many that I've heard some people argue, both Jew and Gentile argue this in conversation with me, that we have all these rules. In fact, there's 613 mitzvot. that Jews are commanded to follow. And I've heard the argument said that, it could be seen to some as being 613. That's a lot of rules, and that could be seen as maybe somewhat excessive at times. Now, yes, Jewish law is quite thorough, and as such, literally almost no part of our lives as Jews are not touched in some way by one aspect of the law or another, and are even guided by it. Okay, but in reality, all the laws that we have, and there are a lot, they're in no way to be seen, nor are they a smothering collection of laws and statutes that are meant to inhibit us or in any way infringe upon our lives and our enjoyment of life and our liberties as human beings. Our laws are meant to sanctify and uplift human life rather than to confine and limit it. The laws of the Torah, which are a lot of them, a great number of them, mostly found here in the book of Leviticus, are divinely inspired laws, codified by ancient Israelites in response to becoming aware of God's existence through his revelations to them. Okay? Think about it this way. In the beginning, we had God making his covenant, with Abraham. Oh, Michael says 613 laws is still a tiny number compared to the amount of laws in the world. That is very, very true. But to be in a situation where you have 613 laws explicitly upon you, that's how some people can argue, wow, that's kind of strenuous or, maybe burdensome in a way, but really it's not. Jeremiah says, true, I think it's still illegal to walk a gator on a leash in New Orleans. It's interesting you should mention that, Jeremiah. On a quick side note, the other night I was just bored killing time, and I was looking, I came across a website of dumb laws on some of the states in the United States, and I found out that here in my home state of California, it is legal in the city of San Francisco to walk an elephant down the street, so long as that the elephant is on a leash and is wearing a diaper. Crazy laws. Aubrey says the Kitzur sorry, my Hebrew is terrible. There's about 2,000 pages with English translation note. The 630 is more analogous to a constitution. Michael says the Jewish nation's constitution. Yep, we have our own formulation of our own rules and society. Look at it this way: the Torah could be considered as the model and the blueprint of our U.S. Constitution, because our country, if you're here in the United States, we set up a society. Our forefathers set up a society based on rules and laws, which is exactly what the ancient Israelites did. They were chosen, came to God. God's like, here I am, you guys are my chosen people, create a society. So they basically are doing thousands of years beforehand what our forefathers did, which is create a society of rules. To be in the Jewish people's case, it's a society of rules to be, for fairness, leading a good, moral, legal, law-abiding life. And on top of that, they had the charge of being God's light unto the world, God's holy nation, God's chosen people. Now, up until what we can understand with the Torah is, I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. We had early on, God made his covenant with Abraham, and so the people, the Israelites, after a while, all knew about God. They had never, directly seen a revelation from God, but they knew about God. They knew the stories of the God of our fathers and everything. And as time goes on, now they've seen the revelation. They've seen the revelation. They've seen the fact that God does exist. They saw all the miracles that God has performed. They saw God, defeat the Egyptians with the 10 plagues. They saw God sustain them firsthand through the wilderness on the way to Sinai. The manna from heaven, rock water coming from a rock in the desert. So they've seen the miracles of God. And then they get to Sinai, and at this point, then they've seen God literally speaks to them. So now it's like God has handed off the ball to them. It's like, okay, now of here. You've seen everything I've done. You know that I'm here. You know that you are my chosen people. Now I'm handing the ball to you, where you create a society fitting of being my chosen people, fitting of being a nation of priests and holy people, fitting of being a light unto the other nations to exemplify, godly living and godly laws. I'm trying to find out where I am in my notes here. There you go. The laws of the Torah, most notably found in the book of Leviticus, are, like I said, divinely inspired laws codified by ancient Israelites in response to becoming aware of God's existence through his revelations to them, in an attempt to create a society of rules that they felt would be most befitting of a nation and of a people who had been chosen by God to be a light unto the nations. When viewed in the context of the time in which they were written, one can see how the laws found in the Torah are actually quite reactionary in nature and correlate perfectly with the intellect and the amount of knowledge of things that God had made available to the people living at the time. This allows us to interpret the laws in a manner that demonstrates that the Torah, still to this day, is a very living, growing document. As time progresses, and God has given and continues to give us more and more knowledge and understanding of things like science, nature, and medicine, we can learn and see and figure out how to interpret Torah laws in a manner that still has validity and meaning to our lives even to this day. The point what I'm making is that there are a lot of rules, and that every Jew, whether you are born Jewish or whether you convert as I did and become a Jew, you agree to take on and do your best to uphold all these laws. And there are a lot, but it's nothing in a way that's, to the outsider it could seem very smothering, and like a lot of people say that, oh, well, Judaism is just a religion of strict laws and codes, and it's just that. But it's not really that. First off, the laws, it's not that hard to follow, because a lot of the laws really can be seen in a lot of ways as common sense. It's not that hard, and once you get into the habit of doing it, it becomes second nature to you. It's literally, in a way, it becomes like breathing. You just do it naturally. There are quite a few things which in our tradition, are termed as rules and laws, but upon examining of them, as I just said, a great many of them are actually matters that can be qualified as common sense. If a person understands common sense, like we understand the idea that, thou shalt not murder, okay, thou shalt not steal, things like that, that's pretty much common sense. You don't need to really think about that and examine that and be like, oh, I really need to make sure I don't murder someone today, or really need to make sure I don't steal someone's property or steal something today. To most people, that's pretty much common sense. So then, if we see it that way, then it's almost as like those laws are already written upon our hearts and our minds, which kind of, in a way, could be seen as taking us one step closer towards Olam Haba, because we're taught in those times that, the words of the law would be written right upon our hearts and our mind, and we wouldn't need to study it. So some of these things are already in our hearts and our minds because they could be qualified as common sense, or how, if you want to look at it that way, then that takes us one step closer. Jeremiah, you just said it right, the same thing I said. Basically, all laws are common sense. But I use don't date your friend's mom. Hey, you know what? If you interpret it in the best way that's simplest and easy for us to understand, that works. Now, there is a teaching and a law that I'm going to really focus on that is brought up in our Parsha this week, and I'm going to spend a little time specifically talking about this particular law, if y'all don't mind. Now this is a law that has been perplexing and even disturbing to a great many people for a long time, and it's basically the law in which I mentioned it earlier when we were discussing the Parsha in a nutshell, where it says that a Kohen with a physical deformity cannot serve in the holy temple. Okay. This is the law which it sounds like that God's discriminating against those of the priesthood who are in some way deformed or disabled, and telling them not to come near or enter into the holy, lest they profane and defile it. Okay. Now we understand, of course, that the light of God lives and exists in all people, even those who have a deformity or a disability. I can remember when I was converting and really coming to know the Torah and really studying the Torah, this particular verse that we're talking about now, it really bothered me for a very long time, because it does sound like God is, in a way, if you look at it on the surface, take it at point value, it sounds like God is basically being discriminatory and being prejudiced against the disabled. And I have a disability. I have muscular dystrophy. I was born with it. And I'm thinking, so wait a minute. God chose to create me this way for whatever reason. You know, God knows best. He chose to create me this way for this reason, and now it seems like he's going to discriminate against me. A lot of people have that same problem with this verse. It's like, wow, what is God saying here? Is God being cruel? But there are ways you can look at it that, you know, kind of takes the sting off of it and kind of makes us realize that at first the words on the page maybe aren't worded as eloquently, because, you know, it was written by the ancient Israelites, you know, laws that are inspired by God. So you got to understand is that, you know, if God is speaking through us, we don't always phrase things the best way, most eloquent and elegant way possible. And I'm holding that, and I'm saying that in terms of 21st century standards. Okay, now when we're talking about the time when the Torah was written, we're talking about ancient Bronze Age man. A little bit less highly intellectual in ability and capability as we are today. So getting back to what I was saying, we all know that the light of God and the Spirit of God, it lives and exists in everybody, in all of us, you know, regardless of your race or religion, or, you know, regardless of if you're able-bodied or disabled. Okay, God's light and God's divine spark lives in all of you. Michael asks, did they write it in a result of ignorance of medical knowledge? Keeping with the reactionary idea of the Torah, Yes, it's basically the God of the gaps theory in a way. Okay, people at the time, God hadn't. Okay, obviously God is the ultimate knowledge, and God obviously knows everything about everything because He created everything. Okay, so God has had this infinite, huge amount of knowledge since the very, very metaphorically, I'd say, since the very beginning of God. Since, if you want to say God self-actualized or whatever, you know, actually the Torah is about 5,000 years old. God is infinitely older than the Torah, obviously. Thank you for that, Jeremiah. Um, but so God has all this knowledge, which He's always had. Okay. Now, us, however, He has to give us knowledge, like all the knowledge that we have now. I mean, we're a pretty advanced society of people nowadays. Okay, think about, and it's taken us how many thousands of years to get to the point in our where we have the knowledge that we have now. Okay, and all that knowledge being created by God comes from God. God has to give us that knowledge in little bits and little increments at a time. Okay, because He can handle knowing it all at once because He knew it all at once from the very beginning. We can't do that. Okay, could you imagine how it would have totally boggled the finite and limited human mind if from the moment of our creation we were given every amount of knowledge that we have to, like, right now? Can you imagine if we were given it all back then instead of the little increments as we figure things out? In 5,000 years, just think how different Judaism will be. That's very true, Jeremiah. I think that's could be really exciting because as long as we make sure that we keep going forward in the right direction, it could just keep getting better and better and better. Plus, if Hashem talked about our lives back then, well, I think about it and I look at it this way, and this explains how the Torah can be seen as all the Torah law. It's very much reactionary. Okay, obviously several thousand years ago, 5,000 years ago, when the Torah was written, obviously people didn't know as much then as they know now. So, as I referenced before, the God of the gaps theory comes in, where if you don't understand something, God fills that gap. Okay, God gives us more and more and more knowledge to figure out and understand things, through our understanding of, nature and science and medicine. That doesn't mean that God is removing Himself or making Himself less important. He just knows that, okay, they've reached this point in their existence where they can handle this knowledge. Case in point, in last week's Torah Parsha, it mentioned the idea. There was the teaching. We all know the teaching that says if a man lies with another man as he lies with a woman, and they say it's an abomination. A lot of people nowadays interpret that in a very homophobic stance. There are those who use that in a way to say, oh, look, God is condemning homosexuality. You shouldn't do this because God says so. We understand now, okay, we understand now in the world that say things like if a person is homosexual, okay, that's just who they are. It's not anything sinful or evil. They're not doing it to be a middle finger in God's face, like, hey, God, I'm defying you, blah, blah, blah. That's just who the person is. We understand that, and we know that medically and scientifically now. There's nothing wrong with the person at all. That's just part of who they are. and therefore you shouldn't treat anyone any different or any less just for being who they are. Okay, because God created that person, He loves them, so why should you treat them any different? Looking at it in the time frame of when the Torah was written, you can sort of understand if you see it through the mindset of the limited intellect at the time. If you look back in history, I know that there was a plague going around in the ancient world. I know this plague killed Alexander the Great, who was a known homosexual, and many others. This plague seemed to affect men who practice homosexuality. Now, obviously, at the time, nobody could understand the idea of, say, sexually transmitted diseases or plagues like AIDS or things like that, because God hadn't yet given us that understanding and that knowledge of science and medical science. So, the God of the Gaps theory clicks in. What's the reaction? Oh, we don't know why these specific people are getting sick from this. Well, what they're doing must be offending God, and God must be punishing them. That's how the reactionary idea of the Torah works. But it also works with the idea, is that how it allows the Torah to be a living document where, as our knowledge grows, we can look back and say, okay, this is how they did it and saw the world back then. We know better now, so we need to maybe change our thoughts. Michael says, and to me it sounds like Hashem is condemning the sexual substitution against one's own identity. If someone was gay trying to be straight. That is interesting. I'm going to reread that. To me it sounds like Hashem is condemning the sexual substitution against one's own identity. That's wow. That's good. That's just boggling my mind right now so much that I'm getting off track. It's a very, very interesting point. Now, as what we've just been discussing, we can apply that to, with what our Torah portion for this week says. We're getting back to, it seems that God is being discriminatory against the disabled. Okay? Now we know again that the light of God exists in all of us. Regardless of your race, creed, color, religion, age, belief, whether you have a disability, whether you're able-bodied. Okay, if God created you, God loves you. His light exists in you. Okay. Now, God, in accordance to His plan for the universe and each and every one of us living in it, He creates those who are disabled or differently abled for a reason that we may not understand. I personally have gone through this thought process many times in my life as a person living with a disability. We may not understand. I sometimes don't understand why God made me the way He chose to make me, but may not understand it. But in God's perfect wisdom, we have to trust and understand that to Him it makes sense. There's a greater purpose behind everything. So why does the Torah tell us what He does? That those who are deformed or disabled may not come near or into the holy to offer sacrifice, because, as the Torah says, they are imperfect and their imperfection will profane God. Does God mean to discriminate against those whom He created differently? Because He created them differently? Basically, you can put a simple question here, put it in straight, no holds barred layman English. Is God making a jerk move here? Or is there something deeper to it? Can we interpret the passage in a way that allows us to see wisdom in what on the surface seems like mistreatment and exclusion of those who are different, who are unfortunately forced to live life with greater challenges than most others. What do you guys think? Can you see, just looking at the words on the page, can you infer or try to find something deeper in this that is deeper than just God, being, what, I don't want disabled people coming near my temple because it offends me, even though I created them this way. What do you guys think? If you have any thoughts on that, please just speak up. Because I have my thoughts on it because I know I live it, so maybe that gives me a little in. There are a couple schools of thought. One school of thought holds that God means no ill will towards the deformed or the disabled, but again, that God understands the simplicity of the human mind at the time in which the Torah was written. Mankind at this time, in its limited knowledge and understanding of things, at this time they used and relied upon representative symbols and that scared me. Sorry, I heard some background noise here. Mankind used and relied upon symbols to represent things and help them understand the things and ideas that tended to be very complex in origin. And let's put it this way, the Torah and even God itself can seem very complex in origin at times. God, although God is not a physical being, is taught to be a being of strength, power, and perfection. Therefore, because God understands that, people at the time, in the limited intellect and limited mind frame they had at the time, God understands that people need symbols. They need to be able to see something so they can really grasp it. They need to be able to see it, embrace it, touch it, feel it, smell it, without it being idolatrous. You can use a symbol as long as it doesn't cross over into idolatry, because then it's blasphemy. But God knows that the people at the time needed things like that. So therefore, in that understanding, the priest would need to be seen as a physical reflection of the God of Spirit that they serve and minister to the people regarding. So the priest would have to appear, if the priest is seen as a representation in a way of God's goodness, and in a way God himself, not saying that he is God himself, but it is sort of a representation of God here on earth, then God is taught to be, and we know God to be powerful and strength and might and flawlessness in a way. So wouldn't then it sort of dictate that those representing him need to be a reflection of that? God understands that, if he's in all people, that means that God even is a reflection of the disabled person, the imperfect person, the person who is differently able. But he knows that at the time, in the mind frame of the people at the time, they needed to see something that was not flawed. They needed to see something that could, in human terms, be considered as being as close to perfect as possible. Where are we at here? Another school of thought in this matter follows the line of thought of the rabbis of classical Judaism, namely of the Talmudic period. Now, the rabbis at this time tend to view the teachings of the Torah as poetry, allegory, and legend that's used to teach stories of great moral teachings and great moral meanings and holy behavior to people. Again, the Torah was written by ancient Jews as a codified book of laws, created in reaction to becoming aware of God and in an attempt to create a society that they believed to be most befitting and pleasing to him. Thus, the laws were written and codified on a reactionary basis to the understanding of the world around them at the time. A person with a deformity or disability from birth, or say a person who, as they're living, gets a naturally develops a disability over the course of their life. While nowadays this can be medically explained, such knowledge of science and medicine didn't exist back then. So in the mind frame at the time, the most logical conclusion was that the person must have had some sin or in some way it angered God. This is really quite the imperfect science in a way if you look at it, but it fits perfectly along the lines of the mindset of the limited knowledge of the people at the time and what they had access to. Using this understanding of the Torah, it allows the Torah again to continue to be a living document. It keeps it from being, basically a static book of archaic laws. I also personally, when talking about this idea of our Torah portion this week, to me, I learned to think about it and interpret it as a way that, maybe God is saying that, you have an extra challenge. The disabled person or whatever, person with any disability, whether it be mental, physical, emotional, on top of all the requirements that you have of leading a Jewish life, which can be challenging sometimes, God's saying, I've chosen, for whatever reason, to lay an extra challenge upon you. So you don't have to worry about coming to me. I'll be there and come to you. So maybe I've looked at it that way. Maybe that's what God is trying to say to us too. On the surface, though, we can agree it looks like God is saying, I don't want disabled people coming near me or those with any imperfections or anything. But when we take the time and look at it deeper, we can see that, God doesn't seem to be being as cruel as the statement says, what it sounds like it's saying. Again, it's the words of a perfect being translated and written down by imperfect minds. So you have to bear that in mind. Now, moving on, our Parsha for this week concludes with the story of a man tried and executed on charges of blasphemy for pronouncing God's name. And hold on one second, I'm going to reload this because it's not, things seem to have slowed down a bit. There we go. I was wondering why it seemed like everyone had disappeared, but my computer had timed out. Am I still with everybody? Can everybody still hear me? Still moving here? Yes, we are. Okay, we're good. Awesome. I had feared that I had lost you guys for a second because I just recently got new internet service, and it's a lot more powerful, but I'm still working the bugs out and trying to understand some of the new glitches of it. So I had feared that I had lost everyone for a moment. But I'm glad you're all still here with me. Okay, so as I was saying, we're coming to the end of our Parsha for this week. We're told of the story of a man who's tried and executed on blasphemy charges. And it's told that he pronounced God's name in blasphemy. Now this alludes to why in our tradition, in the Jewish tradition, we don't pronounce the holy name of God. We use other names for him like Adonai, Hashem, other things. I like to refer to God in prayer sometimes as Adonai Rapha, which means the God that heals. So there's all these names for God, except the one name we don't pronounce, is his true name, which is holy. It's represented by the letters Yod He Vov He, the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, which is unpronounceable. Now, this alludes to why in Jewish tradition we don't pronounce the holy name of God. Unlike other sacred and holy things, which were confined to, say, the tabernacle and the priests, and thus only accessible to members of the priesthood, the holy name, God's name, is thus the only thing I lost my place here. There we go. The holy name was the one sacred article that was accessible to all the people at the time. Therefore, because everyone had access to the idea of the holy name, there was a greater propensity for it to be taken in vain and blasphemed. Thus began the tradition of the Jewish people, of the Israelites, just not to pronounce the holy name of God. It's done as a measure of showing utmost respect, as to our human knowledge, the holy name of God is believed to be unpronounceable, and to try to pronounce it and doing so incorrectly could be seen as a matter of disrespect. But also, the prohibition of pronouncing the holy name, it works as a deterrent, which prevents us from taking the name in vain. There's, the commandment says that you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. Well, you're pretty much covered on all bases. You can't take the Lord's name in vain if, you can't take his name in vain and thereby possibly blaspheme it if you don't ever dare to utter or pronounce it. It's perfectly effective practice because, one can only take the name in vain if you say it. If you don't ever dare to pronounce it, then you're pretty safe. It's a pretty effective deterrent if you really think about it. And then our Parsha draws to a close with the idea of the punishment for a crime befitting the crime itself. Basically, the whole, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, blow for blow idea. You wouldn't want someone to come up to you and put your eye out. So don't do that to someone else, because if you do that to someone, it's gonna be done to you. They have the right to hold you down and put your eye out if you put their eye out. Now, if you do it accidentally, then it becomes a means of restitution, where it's not like a vengeance punishment, but it's talking more on the ideas of where if you intentionally do it, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, blow for blow, life for life. If you murder somebody, the punishment is that you pay for the life you took intentionally. You pay for that with your own life. If you break someone's arm and you did it with malicious intent, then guess what? You're going to have your arm broken. It can seem very harsh and kind of like, wow, over the top, cruel all the time, but it worked as an effective deterrent. So it's one of these things that just works with part of Jewish law. That the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Basically, don't do it if you don't want it done to you, in a way. Which brings us to, we could see that in a way as, the whole of the Torah, which I remember, I think it was Rabbi Hillel said when asked point blank what was the overriding whole and the meaning of the Torah, Rabbi Hillel answered, he said that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man, do not do upon your brother. The rest is commentary. Go study. So that brings us to a close this week. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask, whether on what we talked about? Audie says, as I like to say, turning the other cheek is a Jesus thing. Yeah, very much so. To me, I've always seen that, and a lot of other individuals see that too, as weakness and cowardly in a way. You have the right, and that's one of the things that is very almost exclusive in a way to our tradition, is that you have a right to defend yourself. Our tradition doesn't say go out and do this, go out and take a swing at people or whatever. It says, yeah, you shouldn't do that just because it's not the right thing to do. However, if someone walks up to you and gives you a black eye, we're not expected to like turn the other cheek and pray for them and wish good upon them. That's the act of a cowardly dog who rolls over upon being kicked. Okay, we're told and we're taught that you have the right to defend yourself. If somebody gives you a black eye, you have every right to give them a black eye too. Because that's going to work as a deterrent too. That person is going to think about it the next time he wants to take a swing at someone, possibly give someone else a black eye. He's going to be thinking, "Oh, wait a minute! Last time I did this, the dude that I hit me back and messed me up just as bad as I messed him up, and I don't want to get messed up, so I'm not going to do that again." Works again with what we were talking about earlier, the whole idea of the Torah being very reactive in nature. We should try to be proactive, but you can't do that all the time. You can't always be proactive. There comes times where you have to be and you have to see the world from a reactionary basis. And the Torah understands that and teaches that completely. The Torah is very interesting in where it acknowledges and deals with the psychological aspect of human anger. It recognizes it and it teaches us ways of handling it, for punitive measures, but also in healthy outlet sort of ways, whereas opposed to in the Christian Bible where their New Testament comes along and their Jesus comes along, he basically tries to tell everybody, bury it all within yourself. Suck it up. Be the whipping post. Be everyone's punching bag. You know what? If someone hits you, don't hit them back. Pray for them. Be nice to them. That's not human nature. The human nature is, obviously we have the instinct and the drive towards self-preservation, and that's there because we know that God created us, and if it's in us, then God must have created it. We have the drive towards self-preservation. Therefore, that means that, we have the right to defend ourselves, and the Torah understands that and regards it in a way that is perfectly natural and something we don't have to oppress. Anybody else have anything? Any questions? Anything else that they want to add? Just comments or anything? Bri, you talk too much? Anything like that? Michael's good. I'm gonna assume then that everyone else is good because it's pretty quiet. Before I sign off here, real quick, we ask here at OneShul, we ask for if you've attended a class or anything, if you've really been touched by it, helped by it, we ask that you donate $5. You can donate. We ask that you can donate $5 to us here at OneShul because it takes money to keep the lights on, it takes money to keep running this on, keep bringing all this Jewish goodness to you. So, if you want to, if you're so moved, help us help you, and it would be greatly appreciated. With that, I'm going to bring this to a close and sign off here. As always, it's just been an absolute blast and a total joy to be here with you guys every Monday night. It's one of my favorite parts of the week. I'll be back here next Monday night, and I will see you guys then. I look forward to it all the time. And I just want to let you guys know, you're all my friends. I love each and every one of you. If you haven't added me yet, my name is the first name in the chat room. That is my Facebook link, which has all my other contact links on it. If you haven't added me yet, if you want to, feel free. I'd love to be in contact with you and love to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to sign off here. I will be back in the chat room momentarily once I wrap all this up. In case anybody has any questions they want to ask there, I will hang out as long as anybody wants me to hang out. So with that, everybody, you have a really good night, and I will see you next week.